right, so let's go into the brief demonstration or the illustration I made reference to while we were taking the sprint planning. This is still the overview of what we'll be looking at. It's just laying the foundation for us to understand how all these things work. So this tool is called Jira software. It's a project management tool. Some of us may be used to it, while some may just be seeing this for the first time. So this is one of those tools that you would be making use of in the course of this training program. Jira. Everyone would have access during the practicals. For those taking the practicals, everyone would have access to the board and be able to demonstrate all this. All right, so the project here is house project. So relatively to what we've been using as an illustration, and we have on this side, we have the planning, what we have to plan for, we have the timeline, we have the backlog, we have the board, we have goals, we have issue. There's another that's yet to be here. I will add that later, and that is the reports. This is not the only project on this board. There are other several projects on this board, but this is what we want to make use of for this training class. So on the timeline, you have these ones in the purple color. In Jira, we call them epics. Epics, E-P-I-C-S. So those are epics. Epics are like functionalities. They are like big stories. Big stories. And that is why on this particular board, we are to build a house. We now broke them into big chunks, big stories first. The approval, the foundation, the block work, the roofing, the plastering, the mechanical work, and the finishes. By the time we go through all this, we should arrive at the house completed. However, inside each of these epic, you have the task. I want us to get that clearly. So inside the epics, you have the task, and that is why we can see an arrow on this. I showed us something similar to this in module 1, and that was when we looked at this particular project, wedding party. So the screenshot I made then was for this wedding party, right? And I showed us how this works. That was in the first module. So let's go back to the house project, which we would use for this particular training. So under the timeline again, we have all the epics, and for you to see an arrow at the front, that means it has some other content inside. When we drop them down, we'll see the next color as green. Those greens are called user stories. So all those would form this. So we can see from here, survey for approval, the environmental impact assessment, then the building plan. All these tasks will make up the approval. If we go down here also, we'll see for the foundation, the sand filling, the blinding, the damp-proof concrete, the foundation blocks, and digging. It's not in order of priority. We may decide to do that. Before we sand fill, we need to dig first. So it's something adaptive, something you can adjust as you like. That's under the foundation. If we go under the block work, we have some other stories, task in green, create openings, lintel formation, parapet, layer blocks, and so on and so forth, right? So what you need to know at this point is that we have user stories, then we have epics. Epics are bigger user stories. Epics are bigger chunks. when they are broken down into smaller bits, they become user stories. User stories in Jira could also be broken down into further smaller pieces, and those are called tasks. If you come here and click on create, mind you, work items means what needs to be done in Jira is called issue. So anytime in Jira, and that is peculiar to Jira alone, there are other bots that are not using the same term as Jira. Other bots could be version 1, could be monday.com, could be Azure DevOps bot, could be Asana. So all other ones do not use the same language, but all other ones stick with user stories, epics, and the rest. But what I just want to clarify for you, anytime you see issue in Jira, it means work item. Any work that needs to be done is called issue. How we got here is when I decided to just demonstrate how we create these stories or epics. You come here and click on create, and it brings a new story dialog box. But what I want to show you at this point is issue type. Issue type. If I drop down, you'll see stories, you'll see task, you'll see bug, and you see epic. Epics are the bigger stories, followed by stories. The task, they are smaller to stories. Then the bugs are problems that need to be corrected, an issue that needs to be corrected. That is bugs, right? So if we drop this down again, we can see that all these ones with the green color has no arrow at the front, meaning that they have no task. We can decide to add a particular task to it. Just for demonstration's sake, we could come right here, add a child issue. When I click this, and let me name it for testing, and create it under this environmental impact assessment, and create it, we can see that the color is blue, right? The color is blue and it's under environmental impact assessment. All this you would do by yourself when you get to the practicals. I just refresh it because I expect it to have, I don't know, it should come with an arrow at this point, showing us that I'll check why that later on. There should be an arrow now here indicating that this particular story has some other tasks. But what you need to know at this point is that we have stories, we have epics as the bigger one. Under epics we have stories, and under stories we have tasks. All right, so let's demonstrate what the sprint planning is all about. So the timeline, before we go to the sprint planning proper, the timeline is where we can see all the features or all the stories, which are all items and work items that need to be done, and a timeline for it. That's what makes the timeline itself. So we can decide to determine what time each of this epic will be delivered. So this, when this is plotted, this becomes what we call the Gantt charts. We will see it plotted in a particular direction. So anybody that looks at this board at a quick glance knows the progress of work. All right, so let's now go to sprint planning. Sprint planning is done under the backlog. We can see under the backlog, we have different sprints already that have been created because this is an active board. We have sprint 1. The HP represents house projects. The HP represents house projects. So we have sprint 1, we have sprint 2, we have sprint 3, and we have the backlog. We can create as many sprints as we want. The backlog, this backlog under Jira represents the product backlog. You know, the 353, the third one, talks about the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the product increments. So the product backlog is this portion under Jira termed as backlog. So when you are writing new stories, they will be coming under the backlog. Whereas we have created sprints for work that would be done. So we have sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3. When we check each one, it's a 2-week sprint. I would take some time to update this one. It's one of the board we used in the past so that it could be reflective. Each of these stories are movable. So we can decide to move all these stories from sprint 3 what are you doing? I wanted to do multiple selection. Okay, and move everything. You can either move everything at this point, top of backlog, bottom of backlog, move up, move down, sprint 1 or sprint 2. Or you can also click and drag. So you see that sprint 3 is now empty. Sprint 3 is now empty because I've moved all the stories from sprint 3 back to the backlog, right? I could do the same thing here where I'll select all the stories and move them, but I'm not doing that now. But this sprint 1 is an active sprint. You could see on this side it has complete sprint. When we go to the next tab here, it shows the board. So the board shows us what is active. We'll be coming back to this one when we go through the daily stand-up. But because we're discussing the sprint planning at this time, that's why we're looking at the backlog. So what happens during the sprint planning is that the team comes together, the product owner, the scrum master, and the development team members come together, and they decide which of those stories they want to work on in that sprint. So let's use sprint 3 as an illustration for sprint planning. So we are now checking, so what do we want to work on in the next sprint? Let's say the capacity of the team is to work on 10 stories per sprint. 10 stories per sprint. Mind you, when we're talking about sprint planning, I mentioned the INVEST criteria that stands for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and tangible. What that means is that each of those stories must carry the INVEST criteria, must be detailed enough. So we now need to check during the sprint planning, need to check each of the story and ask ourselves, does it carry the needed information? The essence of the sprint planning is to ensure that each developer that would work on that piece of work clearly understands what needs to be done without calling anybody, without asking that he needs some help. It's making the work clear enough so that they could deliver on it. So during sprint planning, we check each of the story, ask ourselves, do we understand what we need to do? So this is the description of this. As an electrician, I will be burying the pipes inside the wall so that it will serve as sleeves for electrical wires around the house. That is the task that needs to be done. There are other details there which we call the design note. The design note is for any other details when we go further, or rather on the product owner's product owner training is when we dig deeper to talk more about writing user story. But for the Scrum Master, a good Scrum Master also needs to know how to write user story, but it's not in this particular topic. These stories actually on the field would have been written by the product owner before the sprint planning session. Mind you, I said earlier in previous classes that the role of the product owner is serving as the link between the business or the stakeholder and the development team. So the product owner knows what the stakeholder or business or end users want and had written a task, a story for it. So during the sprint planning, the developers need to understand clearly what the product owner wants. And it comes with, it's important to have what we call acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria is how do we know that that work had been done properly, and it's written before the work is done. Is that clear to us? The acceptance criteria is written along with the detail of what needs to be done. The acceptance criteria is written when the product owner is also writing the task that needs to be done. So the acceptance criteria talks about how we get to know that the work has been done properly. So it becomes a guide for the developer that would be working on that particular work item, right? So all those would have been done earlier. You ensure that the inverse criteria is done thoroughly with this each of those story. Each of the story ensure that each of the story meets definition of ready, where it is independent enough. If you look at this story, it's independent enough. It's something you can do a start to finish on. It is also negotiable. We can discuss about this story, which is what will be done during the sprint planning. It has a value, a definite value. We can determine what value this story would give us at the end of the sprint. At the end of the sprint, we would be seeing pipes around the house. That is the value it has given us. It is also estimable, whereby we can know how long it will take for that story to be completed. So for instance, the developer would now in the sprint planning give an estimate. All the rest of the team would be doing that. There is a tool we use for that called Planning Poker. When we get to the practicals, you would see how Planning Poker is used precisely for estimation. We'll just go over it briefly during the classes, but at the practical, you will see it clearly, right? So the developers would be able to come up with an estimate of when the work would be delivered. And this particular in Jira gives us the opportunity to write what the estimates for that story could be. So I've just added 3 to this. There is what we call, it's under the product owner training, what we call Fibonacci sequence. Fibonacci sequence is, you could just note it down and read it up, but those who will be going through the product owner training, we would expand and expansate on the Fibonacci sequence properly. But just know for this particular class, this is an estimate. You can see story point estimate. So a 3 could just give us an idea. That 3 as decided by the team could mean 3 days. It could mean 3 hours. It could mean whatsoever the team has decided that their estimation point would translate into. And that is what they stick with. So if a team decides that 3 points means 3 days, 2 points means 2 days, so anytime a story is added, we get to know, have an idea when that story would be completed. That is what estimation is. However, let me quickly point out, in Fibonacci sequence, that I mentioned about, it has a sequence of numbering 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, on and on. It adds the last 2 digits to form the next one. So after 1, you have 2. So the next one after 2 will be 1 plus 2 will give you 3. The next one after 3 will be 2 plus 3 will give you 5. The next one after 5 will be 3 plus 5 will give you 8. The next one after 8 will be 5 plus 8 will give you 13. So it goes in that order. That is what Fibonacci sequence is all about. When we get to the practicals again, we'll get it more clearer. So we're going through the inverse criteria. We've ensured that this story is independent, it's standing on its own. Standing on its own means it's something we can start and finish within that sprint. We don't need it to extend it further. We don't also have any other thing that is affecting it. It is not that when we get to the field to start work, we now realize that pipes are not supplied. That means that this story is not meant to sprint in the first place. Meaning also that this story does not meet the definition of ready. Let me take that again to make it clear to us. This particular story that says, as an electrician, I will be burying the pipes inside the walls so that it will serve as sleeves for electric wires around the house. That is what needs to be done. If while we are planning for this story, we have an understanding that it will take 3 days to work on, we have an understanding of the acceptance criteria that this story would carry what we expect the value to be. We also have a clear understanding of the developer that has the capacity to work on that story. However, there are no pipes ready to work on. That means if we bring this story to the sprint, we cannot even work on it. Then that story does not meet definition of ready. When there is any element missing, such a story does not meet the definition of ready. I hope that is clear to us. So we check all those. We have an idea how long it will take. We've estimated that story, talking about E. We check the story, it is small enough. It is what we can start within the duration of our sprint. Then it is what we can test also. When the developer comes back to say, oh, I finished the work, the tester can jump on that story and test it and ensure that it meets the acceptance criteria. At that point, this story has then now met the inverse criteria. And this is what we need to do during the sprint planning meeting or event for each of the stories. So that needs to be clear to us. Inverse criteria must be done or should be done for each of the story. So when each of the story meets, in this case now, we've discussed about this story. We know we have the capacity to work on this story. We know we have the availability to work on this story. We know the resources needed are ready. We know everything is ready. Then the story meets the definition of ready. And it has a value. It's what we need to work on now. Mind you, the product owner communicated from the stakeholders that story needs to be worked on. Then the story can now be prepared or moved to a sprint that is waiting to commence. So we do same to each of the story. Let's assume we've done this for each of the story. We do same and move them upwards. We've done for this also. We move them upwards. That is when we can now start the sprint. So that is what happens during the sprint planning session. So after we've come back to now start a sprint, then we will then now have this on the board. The stories that we've moved to that sprint, that we've started, will now come to the board, and we can now progress with it on the board. In the next class, I would be taking us through, that will be the daily stand-up, I believe, which is also daily scrum. And we'll look at how this board was created, and how and what value each of these has. So that would be all for this class. Just before we go, so we've dwelt again on each of all these ones and how it applies to the work that needs to be done and reflects on our board for the sprint. See you in the next class.